Hello, Erin Worsham from Case at Duke, and I'm here today with Dr. Rukmini Banerji, the CEO of Pratham. Rukmini, so grateful to you for joining us today. Thank you and welcome. So I'd love to kick off, Rukmini, with asking you to just help us set the stage a little bit for our audience. So would you mind just giving us a brief overview of Pratham and what you do?
We are in India and we work with children and with youth. We've been working on education for the last 25 years. Started with how do you provide preschool opportunities to children in the slums of Mumbai. But from that work grew a lot of the other pieces that we do today. What do you do with kids who are older, who are in school, maybe not learning as well as they should? What do you do with kids who are not in school but need to be brought in? How do you help kids who have dropped out? And over the last 10 years, in fact, we've been also working with youth, helping them get into their first jobs. So it's a whole age range. And I would say broadly, we look at this in terms of how do you help those who've been left out to get in? How do you help those who are getting left behind to catch up? And how do you get a head start to young people or the little kids to make a good beginning?
It's such incredible work that you all are doing and thinking about that range of impact that you're having, from early education through first jobs, as you said, people that are getting left out, helping get them in. It's so important, and certainly even more so in a time of crisis and disruption like we're currently navigating. So I'm excited to hear some of your insights and hard-won lessons learned about how to navigate during times of disruption. And so why don't we start by talking about the adaptations that Pratham has had to make as you're navigating through crisis. So I'd love to start just with that basic question of, can you give me an example or two of the adaptations that you're having to make to your program model right now?
So it's sort of like, it's amazing that we're actually talking about this because we are right in it as we speak. And so, I never learned grammar properly, but I think we are in the present continuous tense.
I'll leave that to you. Since you work in education, I have no idea.
No, and I think I like the word present continuous tense because we are also all still very tense about what is going on. So let me give you an example that in Pratham, we work across India in the education part in two major ways. One is we have direct programs, which means that there is a Pratham instructor working with schools as well as with children in communities. And we do this in somewhere between 7,000 or 8,000 villages and communities. And that program reaches about 1 million kids normally. And the other part of what we do is to work with governments, in partnership with governments, to obviously work within the education system and bring about changes in the way children are taught or the goals that they achieve and so on. So all of this requires face-to-face with children. That's the usual way in which you carry out most educational activity. So inside the schools, there is instructional activity that we do. And in the school where we spend the morning, we spend the afternoon in the community. And what we've been doing over the last several years is that we have groups of kids in the community. And one of the things we've been trying to do is to help them just work on their own without somebody actually teaching them. So this could be projects, it could be hands-on stuff, but stuff that the kids do. So along comes COVID, and overnight schools are closed, so you can't get into the schools. Overnight you can't move, you have to be at home. We are in lockdown now it's been almost a month. And so, but the kids are still there and you want to reach out to them, and what do you do? And I think it was very interesting to us that very naturally people began to reach out in the only way they knew how, which was through phones. But because we are so used to meeting children face to face, we didn't necessarily have people's phone numbers and so on, already in place. But every Pratham person in most of our education programs, deals with 5 villages. And let's say in each of these villages, you have anywhere between 6 to 8 to 10 little children's groups. And we've been, in touch with them. So you maybe had a few phone numbers as well. So this was in our direct programs that we had this kind of social structure already in place. We didn't necessarily have the complete phone connection, but the kids knew us well, and we also had kids in kind of neighborhood groups. And so the phone connections were very quick. You called, you figured out who you knew, you asked kids, don't go to each other's house, but we need to know, how do you get through to so-and-so? And very quickly, these phone numbers multiplied. And so I was just today, in fact, talking to some of our teams that we had at least one peg in every village almost right away. And now we seem to have at least one peg into the original groups and are able to reach at least half, if not more, of the kids who are in the groups, but maybe not till every kid. But the numbers are increasing every day. Now, what are we doing on these phones? So we had one part of Pratham, which was developing a lot of digital resources. And they were working in about 1,000 villages, bringing their digital resources, usually on offline tablets. But these resources existed in a repository. And so what we started doing initially, 3 weeks ago or so, was to send kind of WhatsApp messages with activities in them. And we called it Corona Thodi Masti Thodi Padhai. Corona is a play on the word Corona because in many Indian languages, it means do it. And the Thodi Masti Thodi Padhai is a little fun and a little learning. And with the idea was that in this kind of tense time, you need engagement, you need creative stuff to do so that, it gets your mind off of, whatever's happening around you. And through that kind of hands-on activity, I think you're going to learn a lot anyway. We also wanted to send things that actually engage the whole family because we see parents as going to be, or already are, but I think parents are at the forefront of what will happen with kids now. So what kind of activities can you send that engages the whole family without too much gradation of age and subject and stuff like that? And so, it was almost like the two pillars that we had of our programs were in different places. The digital was doing its stuff. The rest of the education programs were doing this building of social structures in the community, in addition to being in school. And we were able to bring these two pillars together and kind of just connect them in a new way and be able to reach out to kids. So I think that this has all happened pretty quickly and in a very kind of organic way, because the first instinct of Pratham teams was, I need to reach the kids. I need to see how they're doing. I need to talk to the parents. And so, you started doing that anyway, and you were able to structure that to be able to send these kinds of engagement activities. So as of today, we are able to reach out to something like 11,000 villages and urban communities. And the number of messages going out every day, WhatsApp messages, of course, we realized quite quickly that half the phone numbers we were getting were not from smartphones. So there's a lot talked about, internet penetration and smartphone penetration. And while they may exist, all these smartphones everywhere, but kids don't have access to smartphones in a regular way. And so half the numbers we got were actually what we call the old phones. And so we had to scramble to have things that you could send out through SMS messages. So I think overnight we had like a huge amount of creative activity of what you can do in 160 characters. And those 160 characters, how do they map onto 10 Indian languages? And, everybody, I'm sure this is true for you as well, finds that because you're not stirring out, you're like way busier than you were because you're having to do all these new things. Mm-hmm. So we have these messages which are going out. There are phone calls. So it's not just that the message goes out, but the Pratham person who knew the kids and knew the villages calls. So we have this voice call. I mean, this not just a voice call, a person that you know is going to call you. And that's causing a lot of excitement and also another layer of engagement, because it's not an unknown person. It's a person that you knew, a person that you knew your kids, a person that was connected to you because of education. And in many cases, people feel that they are much more closely involved, even though physically they are further away. And I think that part of this, I don't know whether even to call it adaptation anymore. I mean, already, even though it's been 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we feel that this is a connect that we are going to keep. This has to endure, because we've learned a lot about how to do this. We are constantly learning, we're going to learn more. But this is not something that I think we're going to abandon anytime soon.
I love that. I love that, how quickly, I mean, this is a matter of weeks, right? That you have adapted the programming, and that the staff has really just jumped in to say, we need to meet the kids. And I also heard just a lot of really interesting themes of how you're approaching it, of this balance of a technology and digital solution, but really married with the social structure and the calls from someone to engage your audience. So really that balance of technological innovation, but not forgetting about the relationships and the people and the social structures that are part of that undergird that. And I also just love that, as you said, in a really tense time of crisis, trying to remember that people want to be engaged, and that there's ways to do that in a fun and creative way to reach out and have the lessons. So really interesting things that you shared, and I have so many follow-up questions that I want to come back to you with. So let me start with a couple. I'll jump around a little bit. I'm really struck as you started to talk about the smartphones versus old phones, and I think this is something we're seeing across the world, that COVID-19 is having a really disproportionate impact on certain populations, certainly from a health perspective, but also educational outcomes. And so how are you thinking about really the equity lens around the adaptations that you're making sure that in this time you're able to meet even the most under-resourced communities that have the potential to have the gap extended in a time like this? So how are you approaching equity in a time of crisis?
So I think the first thing for us was that if our tagline is every child in school and learning well, so that every is really quite important to us. And I see, as I talk to my team members, we are a large team, more than 7,000 people, how much that every is a part of the DNA of how our teams think. So this every is a concern. And so to do the every, the old phones were a must. And if the old phones were a must, we didn't have things that were ready-made, but you started sending them out. And not only that, we had not anticipated a WhatsApp. You can put many people on the broadcast group and send it, and it's practically free. But the SMS costs money. And so most of the packs that Pratham people have 100 free SMS messages a day. You haven't thought about that because nobody's sending that many SMSs anymore. But how do you quickly use and be within that limit? Because you can't go out of the house to recharge your phones or do other things right now. So what are the boundaries that are available to you? And within that, how do you get to the kid who is waiting for you? Because so the SMS technology, the SMS stuff is a must. Without that, we would be leaving out a lot of kids. The other thing is, even in thinking about activities, there are kids who can't read and there are parents who can't read. So what are they going to do when they get this SMS, right? And so, having it as simple as possible, the person phoning you is saying, doesn't matter if you can't read, just ask your neighbor. It's not that hard. Coming up with activities that maybe uneducated parents can do together with their parents. And so I think that this thought that we had, which also I think came quite naturally, that you want to engage now. You want to bring people together. The lessons can come later. Learning outcomes have waited for 100 years. They can wait another, few months. But getting parents involved is going to be a long run investment. And I think parents, particularly the less educated parents, are really appreciating the fact that you are thinking about, we have this method that we are well known for called teaching at the right level. I think what we are doing right now is talking at the right level and reaching out at the right level, because these levels are different. So as long as your goal is I want to reach everyone, then you figure out how you're going to do that and do it at the level at that which it is possible. So both in terms of a lot of education programs have jumped into doing lessons and chapters and fractions and trigonometry. And that's actually going to frighten a lot of people away, because there are many parents and many kids who are not at that level as yet. So we see this as build a massive platform of engagement, and in whatever way you can, and then we can build off of that as we, as situations change.
I love that. So it's super inspiring to hear you talk about that, and really just reflecting that equity and equity lens has been just part of the DNA of Pratham. And so you're leaning on that in a time of crisis, but not just doing business as you've always done. So leaning on that DNA and keeping that as central to how you approach the adaptations you're making, but then rethinking, how do we deliver in a time, and how do we really understand what all of the children and the stakeholders that we're trying to serve, what their needs are in this moment. So I love that balance of kind of integral core DNA, and making sure you're continuing driving towards that, but then also adapting for the time and the needs of your community. The other thing I want to follow up with you on is as you were talking about the adaptations earlier, you mentioned, these are things that I think will continue after this is all done. And I think in the best case scenario, in a time of disruption, the crisis will force organizations to innovate and create new solutions that hopefully can remain afterwards and be a new way of doing business. But what that requires is that in the time of crisis and disruption, where you're just trying to survive and navigate, that you're also thinking about learning and testing what's working and what's not, and really having that kind of learning feedback culture. And so I'm curious to hear from you of if you're able to think about that right now in the midst of responding to COVID-19, and if so, how are you creating that learning culture to set yourselves up for the future?
So, we're talking a lot. I think one of the first things that has happened is that all these 7,000 people have learned how to use Zoom on their phone, on their device. I'm actually really, really happy that a couple of years ago, we made it possible through kind of a down payment that we were happy to share with our team members, that people have smartphones, because I think that this communication would be greatly impeded if we were not able to at least the core of Pratham has smartphones. So you're able to talk to each other quite a lot. And in fact, there was nothing stopping us from talking so much earlier, but you didn't, because you were meeting and you were traveling and so on. But now, because you can't do that, and because things are having to be quickly communicated, I mean, the first thing was that we needed to make sure that the 7,000 people were safe. So that communication very quickly was set up within the teams. And now we are using that. So just this afternoon, I talked to 2 different states in 2 different parts of the country on these last 2 weeks of messages that have gone out. And we had exactly the same conversation that I'm having with you. Have we reached every kid, or how far away are we from every kid? And what are the ways to get there? And the second one was of the calls that the children are making. The children are also sending stuff back, photographs, videos of what they're doing. What are we seeing, and what are the kids saying, and what are we asking them? And it's very interesting. I mean, I think children are, an incredible source of inputs. So it turns out that I was speaking to one of our teams it's a tribal backward state. And so the smartphones are much lower. What the kids are doing is they're so excited about what they're doing that they're finding somebody in the village with a smartphone and asking them to take photographs and sending them back. So our message goes to them on a basic phone, but their response sometimes comes back from a smartphone. And in the ways that we are tracking the children in the groups, we had child or group and one number. But now we are looking to see that actually the kid is attached to many numbers. And those numbers the other numbers are changing, because it's like, today my cousin was here, I made him send a photograph. Tomorrow so our ways of tracking all this are changing as well. But, simple things like we sent out this week different math activities. And, I'm just giving you the details because I think you'll appreciate it. So one of them was make number cards and take from 1 to 9, and then pick 3 cards and see what's the biggest number you can make and the smallest number you can make. And then if you are able to do this, do it with 4 cards. Okay. And a different activity that went out, and this is all in 160 characters, was how much water does your family use? Do you measure the water in buckets? And if so, how many buckets do you use for what? Overwhelming response from the field is that the bucket one was great fun and everybody got involved. And, parents had to be called back from the field to do the calculations of how many buckets did you use yesterday for washing clothes. And kids are writing these things down, taking pictures of their buckets and sending them back. So what we are seeing is that the everyday type of thing seems to get everybody involved, whereas the more academic type thing that you see in textbooks is what the kid has to do on their own. So as we are in this phase, we'll have to do a mixture of these things, and people had good insights, and they're hearing these from the kids and sort of remembering them and passing them on. So the big challenge today in the conversation was, how do you systematize this so that you're able to all, and I think you can only do it if you talk often. If you raise, okay, I'm wondering, what should I do? Should I do language 1 week and math 1 week, or should I do them mixed up? Let's go away, think about it, do it, and then come back. So I think lots of talk and some focus, some slices will teach us some.
I think that's a great approach to keep it simple in some ways as you think about learning, of doing these interventions and just making sure that you're regularly talking about them and assessing what's working, what's not, and how might we continue to tweak that in the next week, and then talk about how that went. And I love the approach you're taking of really not just how we innovate now, but how do we learn about what's working in those innovations that might influence our programming for here on, past the crisis and into the new normal. I'm going to totally switch topics. So you mentioned earlier, as you were thinking about, as you were talking about your program, just the extensive work that you do in partnership, especially with the governments. And so I want to just get your reflections on partnerships. And in particular, just curious to get your thoughts on how you're thinking about partnerships evolving and adapting during a time of crisis. What's been your approach to evolving partnerships, and any tips you might share with others?
So I would say that, I've often found that even in our normal time, the approach we have with our children and communities and the approach we have with the partnerships, tends to be a little bit different, right? With the children, you didn't have to tell anybody in Pratham that you need to reach out to the children. Everybody was just like jumping in and reaching out. In the partnerships, in that sense, governments have also been caught with basically, unprepared, right? Ill-equipped for how do you suddenly deal with this. And in a lot of cases, the connection between the different layers of the government system obviously is quite strong up to the school. But the school was also caught unprepared and didn't have all the tentacles into the community that you needed to have. Because kids come every day, you meet them every day, you meet the parents of the street. There was and often the teachers are not local, right? So governments obviously felt that they have to do something. And so the first thing to do was, a lot of governments reached out to each other and to us as well. We reached out to some, but this is all at kind of like, how does the government provide a digital cover to what is going on. Now, governments with whom we had an ongoing relationship, we have, for example, 2 states in which we've helped over the last 2 or 3 years, help the government set up a whole kindergarten section, a pre-primary section into their primary school. So there we were an integral part of the institutionalization of this one layer. They moved very quickly to say, we're going to send out activities to parents for the pre-primary lot. And we were able to just move right in and help, and they've more or less taken our entire architecture and put it in. But there are lots of other governments who are thinking about, how do you send out grade 1, chapter 3, lessons for the day and so on. And, where our content could fit in, we've handed it over. And where, we are saying engagement is important. So there are several state governments who are sending academic stuff, and then they're sending, here's a fun activity, and a Pratham fun activity is going. Okay, because, they sort of want to segregate the fun from the, the academic. So there are governments with whom we didn't have any relationship, on an ongoing level, that have reached out. So I think crisis creates new opportunities, new potential for talking. For example, my colleague Devyani, who heads our international work, works with several governments in Africa. And they've been reaching out saying that they want to understand how we are operating here. And in fact, in 2 or 3 countries, they've come up with radio programs. Now, the radio program framework that we have developed in collaboration with Côte d'Ivoire or with Sierra Leone or with other countries, we are also bringing back, and there's a state government in India who wants to do radio programs. So lots of this sharing, of ideas is going on. And I think that this is an incredible opportunity to, learn from each other. A completely unconnected one. I was on some committee. I'm on the board of some other organization who does work in rural livelihoods and on with women's self-help groups. And, I was listening, they had a virtual board meeting, and I was thinking, geez, I mean, you may be working in livelihoods and with rural self-help groups, but they have kids at home. So I sent them some of our digital links. They've taken it on saying, we know what to do with women, but we don't know what to do with. We have a big self-help group. We have a big women's cooperative movement called Seva in India. They are very well known, very large. And so I reached out to them, and they've taken this because they have kids at home as well. I mean, their members have kids at home. So we are seeing partnerships of this kind. Khan Academy, famous, globally known, is creating a schedule in India. And so Khan Academy India has put Pratham's digital content because we have it in 11 languages. So very interesting. And I mean, I now feel like we probably need to have a separate partnerships team just to like manage all these partnerships, because whoever you're reaching out to, small or big, seems to be able to use each other's stuff.
Mm-hmm. It's a great couple of points there of thinking about the opportunity often in crisis and that moment where, often partnerships take, especially with government, take so long to build and to develop those relationships. But in a time of crisis, everyone is really looking to collaborate and to help each other meet needs in much faster timelines. So it sounds like Pratham's really taking advantage of that. And then to your last point, also thinking about what does that mean in terms of our talent and how we need to reorganize roles or think about adapting the responsibilities of our team to make sure we can manage those partnerships as they continue to evolve. Let me ask you one kind of last bit meaty question before we wrap up, as I know this has been fascinating, but I know we're running out of time. But I can't let you go before I ask about the financial side of things. Yeah. So obviously lots of social ventures right now are really stressed about the financial sustainability of their organizations and how to navigate that during a time of crisis. So interested to hear your perspective on how Pratham's approaching financial sustainability. And, if another social enterprise asked you, what's the most important thing I can do right now as it relates to financial sustainability, what would you say to them?
So, obviously this is a question that is on topmost on everyone's mind. And one of the first things we did when the lockdown happened was to start counting money, right? Who owes you how much money? Because, sometimes, it may take 2 weeks, 3 weeks. How much money? We stopped traveling. We stopped travel in Pratham in the first week of March. So we had a whole month of March, and the lockdown started happening only in the third week. So we had a whole no travel, no meetings, no trainings period to actually be able to estimate, how much do we travel and how much does that cost. So by the time we had reached the end of March, we had just our basic wage bill that we were paying out. So how much money do we have? How much are we likely to get? Who's going to change their mind? Who is in what kind of, we have money from many different kinds of sources. Who is getting hit by what kind of source? All these calculations have to be done. So our board as well has gotten much more involved in the nitty-gritties and the nuts and bolts of how, and as I said, we have 7,500 people, wage bill is quite high. And so we made a very calculated, estimation about what we can do in the next 3 months, because beyond that is, we are not sure. And so what we are doing now is to say that if everybody who's supposed to give us money does give it, and maybe we'll have to dip into some reserves. We don't have much reserves. Our board is scrambling to create a kind of a quick stabilization fund. We are looking at where we can get overdraft facilities from. All these things are being done. And we wanted to give our people a little bit of a heads up to plan their own finances as well. So, if I was just dropped today, I have no time to think about what I can do. People being at home is also giving them some sense of, if you don't travel, how do you, all these kinds of things, right? So that's on the one hand. We are going to have to scale back a lot. we can see that because, the world is a different place. But one of the things two things I think very important. One is in this last week, ever since our board agreed that the next up to June, we pay at least the basic salaries, we've communicated this to everybody. So we've been on Zoom calls with every last person. I think by this evening, everyone will have heard this, not just from their immediate team leader, but from multiple layers of people. So a huge communication exercise, again, made possible by video calling, to say that, look, we are in this together. Here's the calculation we've made. And I think it's always good to be upfront. And, I've been on many of these calls and people say, I have a question. So I said, go ahead and ask it. I may not have the answer, but I'm happy to listen. And being just open, just like you'd be with your family, to say, okay, we are on hard times now. What is it that we can do? And we'll think together. So we're doing that. The other thing I think that I hope we are communicating very well is there will be no lack of work. The question is, so, often people ask me, is there an opening in Pratham? I'll say there's no opening, but we are very open. Okay. So, I don't know what we can pay whom and how, but I think there's going to be a ton of work. We are going to be busier than ever. Kids are going to need us. Young people are going to need us. Their families are going to need us. And so what we may have to do is to think about what is the resources we have, how can we spread it amongst ourselves, realizing that we'll all be a lot lower than we were. But I think people need the security. I think they need the dignity of work. They need the relevance of the work. You need the security that we are together in a team, and you need the money. And the money is the only one which is uncertain. All the other things are still there. So the world is a different place. It'll be a poorer place, but we are all here. And so, obviously money will be a big problem for many, but I think the security and the team being together and the fact that you're still being, we are lucky that we are in a field in which kids need us. And, at least that relevance is not going away. It's only going to increase. So I have no great words of advice, but this is what we are doing. And I'd love to hear about other people.
Fantastic. Well, we're excited to.
It's brought people closer. It's brought people closer for sure. You're listening a lot to, we are talking not only about the programs that we run and the work we do, but about, your own worries and, stuff like that. So we'll see.
Fantastic. Really, really hopeful to hear that perspective, and excited to share your perspective as well as the other interviewees that we're doing in the series to have, as everyone's trying to figure out these balances and how to react in these times. Let me ask just one final question to close us out. It's basically a request for advice for other social venture leaders. And in particular, we're interested in organizations like Pratham that are in the midst of scaling their work and the impact. And now in a time of crisis, what is your advice for an organization that's in the process of scaling? What do you do during a time of crisis? Do you keep on trying to scale? Do you pause? Do you pivot? What's some advice to give those scaling social enterprises?
So I think it's a good time to sort of stabilize and stabilize maybe with much less money. And I think this is a time in which and I think the next some months and maybe a year is going to be a time when you realize who your core is. What is your core activity? Who are your core people? What is the core that you're going to be able to sustain? The activity you do may change depending on what community you're in and what people want of you. But I think that this is where you will really know who you are. And, that's always a good thing to have, but we are going to be forced to figure out who we are. And I think we should look forward to that because, that is what you can build off of, as you go later.
Fantastic. Rukmini, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom during just a crazy, challenging time that we're in right now. Appreciate your time and your advice. And I know our audience members do as well. And for our audience, thank you again for joining us. Please join us at scalingpathways.com, where you'll find links to more of the interviews in this series and other resources for organizations that are scaling their impact. And we're looking forward to having you listen in on the next conversation as well. Thank you.